"Get out of my bed," the billionaire CEO said. By morning, her roommate was gone. Welcome, everyone. Before we step into today's deeply emotional journey of two women whose lives become intertwined in the most unexpected way, I would love to ask for your support. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with romance, healing, resilience, and unforgettable emotional moments, please take a second to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. It is completely free, and every subscription helps us continue creating meaningful stories about love, hope, and the courage to open our hearts again. Your support truly means more than words can express. And before we begin, tell us where you are watching from today. Leave your city or country in the comments. We would love to know where our amazing audience is joining us from. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let us return to our story and the unforgettable moment when one simple sentence changed her life forever. Sometimes the coldest words are spoken by people who have spent their entire lives pretending they never needed anyone. The first time Vivian Hayes told me to get out of her bed, I thought she hated me. By sunrise, I was gone, and neither of us understood that those 5 quiet words would become the beginning of a story neither money nor success could have written. 3 months earlier, if someone had told me I would end up sharing a penthouse with one of the youngest billionaire CEOs in New York City, I would have laughed until coffee came out of my nose. My name is Claire Sullivan, and I had spent most of my adult life believing that ordinary people were meant to stay in ordinary places. I taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Brooklyn, tutored students after class, and spent weekends volunteering at a neighborhood community center. My apartment building had been sold to a developer, forcing every tenant to leave with less than 30 days' notice. New York rents climbed faster than my paycheck ever could, and after 2 exhausting weeks of searching, I was beginning to wonder if sleeping in my aging Honda Civic would become a realistic backup plan. Then my friend Megan called with what sounded like the strangest housing offer I had ever heard. Her cousin managed several properties for Hayes Global Holdings, and the company's CEO had recently agreed to rent one of the guest suites in her penthouse to someone temporarily while renovations were being completed in another executive residence. Apparently, the billionaire rarely stayed home anyway. The arrangement would last only 3 months, the rent was unbelievably affordable, and the only conditions were simple: respect the house, respect privacy, and never interfere with work. It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it probably was. Still, desperation has a way of making impossible opportunities look reasonable. The following Monday, I stood in front of a sleek glass tower overlooking Manhattan with 1 suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes, and enough anxiety to power the entire city. The elevator climbed more than 60 floors before opening into a home that looked less like an apartment and more like the cover of an architecture magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, polished wood reflected the afternoon sunlight, and every piece of furniture looked carefully chosen instead of casually purchased. The silence felt expensive. I had barely finished setting my boxes inside the guest room when I heard footsteps approaching across the hardwood floor. They were measured, confident, almost rhythmic. When I turned around, I saw Vivian Hayes for the very first time. She wore a tailored charcoal suit despite it being nearly 7 in the evening, her blonde hair pulled neatly behind one ear, her blue eyes calm but unreadable. She looked younger than every business magazine had made her appear, yet somehow even more intimidating in person. There was no dramatic entrance, no glamorous smile, only quiet confidence wrapped in perfect self-control. She extended her hand with professional politeness. "Claire Sullivan?" she asked. I nodded and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, warm, and brief. "Welcome," she said. "I hope you understand that this is simply a practical arrangement." I smiled politely and answered, "Of course." Neither of us realized that practical arrangements have a strange habit of becoming deeply personal when 2 lonely people accidentally begin sharing the same place they both call home. The first week inside Vivian Hayes's penthouse taught me something I had never learned in any classroom. Loneliness did not always look like an empty apartment or unanswered phone calls. Sometimes it wore an impeccable designer suit, managed a billion-dollar company before breakfast, and returned home every night to absolute silence. Our schedules rarely overlapped. I left before 7 every morning to catch the subway to my school in Brooklyn, carrying a canvas tote stuffed with lesson plans, crayons, and half-graded spelling quizzes. Vivian usually returned long after sunset, often still speaking into a wireless headset as she crossed the living room with purposeful strides. More than once I heard her discussing acquisitions, quarterly projections, or international conference calls while placing her laptop on the kitchen island without ever looking up. Despite sharing the same address, we lived like polite strangers passing through the same train station. Every interaction followed the same quiet rhythm. A simple good morning. A brief thank you. A respectful good night. Nothing more. Yet little details began revealing themselves in the spaces between those conversations. Every morning I noticed that the expensive espresso machine had already brewed fresh coffee, but only one cup had been poured. Every evening I found untouched takeout containers neatly stacked inside the refrigerator because Vivian had once again worked through dinner. One Friday afternoon, my students insisted on baking chocolate chip cookies for the school staff, and they packed several extras for me to take home. Without thinking, I placed a small plate on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note that simply read, "Long weeks deserve fresh cookies." I never expected a response. The next morning, the plate was empty, the note was gone, and sitting beside it was a brand new package of my favorite local coffee beans. There was no signature, but there did not need to be one. That became our unspoken language. I replaced burned-out light bulbs before she noticed they had failed. She quietly repaired the loose wheel on my old suitcase after seeing me struggle with it one evening. I stocked the refrigerator with fresh fruit whenever I went grocery shopping. Somehow the pantry always refilled itself with the expensive oatmeal I liked but could never justify buying. We never mentioned any of it. It simply became part of living together. One rainy Tuesday, my subway line shut down after severe weather delayed service across the city. By the time I reached the penthouse, my clothes were damp despite my umbrella. I stepped inside expecting the usual silence, only to find Vivian asleep on the living room sofa with her laptop still open across a stack of financial reports. The television displayed a financial news channel with the volume muted. For the first time since moving in, she looked less like an unstoppable executive and more like someone completely exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her blue eyes, and one hand still loosely held a pair of reading glasses. I quietly lowered the television volume another notch, draped a folded blanket across her shoulders, and carried the untouched mug of cold coffee into the kitchen. I never intended for her to know. The next morning, as I tied my sneakers near the front door, Vivian walked past with a travel mug in one hand. She paused for only a second before saying, "Thank you for the blanket." Her voice remained calm, almost businesslike, but there was something softer beneath the words that had not been there before. I smiled and answered, "Everyone deserves to rest once in a while." She studied me for a brief moment, as though trying to understand an idea that had never occurred to her before, then quietly nodded and left for work. Standing alone in the apartment, I realized that sometimes the strongest walls do not begin to fall with grand gestures. Sometimes they begin with nothing more than a warm blanket, a plate of homemade cookies, and two people slowly remembering what kindness feels like. Another week passed, and something unexpected happened. The penthouse no longer felt like a luxury hotel occupied by two strangers. It began to feel quietly lived in. I found myself humming while preparing breakfast on Saturday mornings, and instead of the echoing silence that had greeted me during my first days there, I occasionally heard the soft click of Vivian's keyboard from her home office or the distant murmur of a conference call behind a closed door. One Saturday afternoon, I returned from the community center carrying several grocery bags filled with fresh vegetables, soup ingredients, and bread donated by a local bakery for volunteers to take home. As I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed Vivian sitting alone at the island, staring at a spreadsheet glowing across her laptop screen. She was not typing. She was simply looking at it, motionless, as though the numbers had stopped making sense. A mug of coffee sat beside her, untouched and already cold. "Long day?" I asked gently while placing the groceries on the counter. She looked up, almost surprised that someone had spoken. Long month, she answered with a tired smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. I nodded without asking another question. Some people needed conversation when they were overwhelmed. Others simply needed someone nearby who expected nothing from them. I unpacked the groceries in comfortable silence, then noticed a large bowl of lemons sitting untouched in the fruit basket. An idea crossed my mind. Have you ever had homemade chicken lemon soup? I asked. Vivian blinked. I cannot remember the last time someone cooked for me. Then today seems like a good day to change that. She hesitated, almost as if accepting kindness required more courage than negotiating billion-dollar contracts. Finally, she closed her laptop. May I help? The question genuinely surprised me. I smiled and handed her a cutting board. Can you slice the carrots? She picked up the knife with the careful uncertainty of someone attempting a completely unfamiliar task. Within seconds she laughed softly at herself after producing carrot slices in every imaginable size. I think my board of directors would be horrified if they saw this. I laughed with her. Fortunately, soup is not nearly as judgmental as corporate shareholders. The kitchen slowly filled with the comforting aroma of simmering broth, herbs, garlic, and fresh lemon. Outside, rain tapped gently against the towering windows while Manhattan disappeared beneath gray clouds. Inside, something much quieter was changing. Vivian began telling me small stories she had never intended to share. She admitted that she often worked 16-hour days because slowing down made her anxious. She confessed that most people who approached her wanted investments, introductions, or opportunities instead of friendship. Sometimes, she said while stirring the soup with surprising concentration, I wonder whether anyone would still call if I stopped being successful. I looked at her for a long moment before answering honestly. My third graders would. They would probably ask you to judge the science fair and convince you to buy too many boxes of fundraising cookies. She laughed again, this time without hesitation. It was a warm, genuine laugh that transformed her entire expression and made her seem years younger. For the first time, I saw the woman behind the headlines instead of the billionaire behind the company. After dinner, she carried both bowls into the dishwasher before I could stop her. As she reached for the kitchen light, she paused. Claire, she said quietly, this apartment has not felt like a home in a very long time. I looked around at the simple meal we had shared, the empty bowls, the faint scent of fresh bread still lingering in the air, and the city lights beginning to appear beyond the rain-soaked windows. I realized neither of us had noticed how late it had become. Somehow, without either of us planning it, two women from completely different worlds had begun building something far more valuable than convenience. We had started building trust, one ordinary evening at a time. The closer we became, the more I realized that people rarely reveal their deepest struggles through words. They reveal them through habits that almost nobody notices. Vivian still left for work before sunrise on most mornings, but now she sometimes lingered long enough to accept a cup of coffee before heading to the office. We had settled into a comfortable routine that neither of us ever discussed. I prepared breakfast whenever I had time, and she always washed the dishes before leaving, insisting that I had already done enough. Every evening, if one of us knew we would be home late, we left a short handwritten note on the kitchen counter instead of sending a text message. Somehow those simple notes felt more personal. One evening I came home carrying a stack of colorful poster boards for an upcoming school science fair. As I spread them across the dining table, Vivian walked in looking unusually exhausted. She offered me a polite smile, loosened her blazer, and disappeared into her office without saying another word. Hours passed. I finished grading spelling tests, organized classroom materials, and finally noticed that the apartment had become completely silent. Curious, I walked toward her office door, which was slightly open. The room was dim except for the glow of two computer monitors filled with charts and presentations. Vivian sat perfectly still with one hand resting against her forehead. Her eyes were closed, and several unopened bottles of sparkling water stood beside a growing collection of empty coffee cups. For a moment I wondered if I should quietly walk away. Instead, I knocked gently on the doorframe. She opened her eyes immediately and tried to smile. "I did not hear you," she said softly. "I figured that," I replied. "Have you eaten dinner?" She glanced toward the clock as if seeing it for the first time. It was nearly 10 o'clock. "I forgot." I disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later carrying a bowl of warm vegetable soup and a slice of fresh bread. She looked at the tray as though it were something extraordinary. "You really did not have to do this." "I know," I answered. "That is why I wanted to." She accepted the bowl with both hands, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. The quiet felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Finally she sighed. "Everyone assumes pressure becomes easier when you become successful. It does not. It only becomes quieter because nobody expects you to admit you are overwhelmed." I listened without interrupting. She continued staring into the soup before speaking again. "Every decision affects thousands of employees. Every mistake becomes tomorrow's headline. Sometimes I feel as though I have forgotten how to simply exist without solving another problem." I understood that feeling more than she realized. "My students think teachers know everything," I said with a gentle smile. "The truth is that most days I am learning right alongside them. Maybe adults spend too much energy pretending we have all the answers." Vivian looked at me for a long moment before laughing softly. "You make complicated things sound simple." "No," I replied. "I just think people deserve the same kindness we so easily give everyone else." She lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the thought. Before leaving the room, I quietly placed a small lavender sachet beside her keyboard. "My grandmother always kept one near her bed when life became stressful," I explained. "She said peace sometimes begins with something as small as remembering to breathe." The next morning, as I prepared to leave for school, I noticed the sachet resting carefully inside Vivian's briefcase instead of on her desk. She caught me smiling and gave a small nod that said more than any speech could have. Little by little, without either of us realizing it, trust had stopped feeling like something fragile. It was becoming part of the home we were quietly creating together, even though neither of us knew how quickly one painful misunderstanding could test everything we had begun to build. The week that changed everything began with a Monday that refused to end. I could feel the tension before Vivian even walked through the front door. Financial news played across every television screen in the teacher's lounge during my lunch break, and her company seemed to be the headline everywhere. Analysts speculated about a massive merger. Reporters discussed impossible deadlines. Everyone admired her confidence without seeing the pressure hidden beneath it. When I arrived home that evening, the apartment was empty except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I decided to make dinner anyway, hoping that if Vivian came home hungry, there would be something warm waiting for her. I prepared roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and fresh rice, leaving everything covered on the stove. Hours passed while I graded essays from my students. 9 o'clock became 10. 10 became 11. I finally sent her a short note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "Dinner is ready whenever you are. Please remember to eat." After finishing another stack of papers, I noticed the guest room felt unusually warm because the air conditioning had stopped working properly. Since maintenance could not come until the next afternoon, I carried my blanket into the living room to wait for cooler air from the open balcony door. I tried reading for a while, but the long day at school slowly caught up with me. Sometime after midnight I heard the apartment door open. Vivian stepped inside looking more exhausted than I had ever seen her. Her hair had come loose from its usual careful style, and she still held her phone against one ear while quietly apologizing to someone about another delayed meeting. I wanted to greet her, but I had already drifted into a restless sleep without realizing it. A sudden gust of warm air from the balcony made the living room even more uncomfortable, and half awake, I wandered toward the hallway without fully opening my eyes. In my sleepy confusion, I pushed open the wrong bedroom door. Vivian's room was darker and noticeably cooler because its separate climate controls had been working all evening. Without thinking, I sat down for only a moment, intending to rest before walking back to the living room. The mattress felt unbelievably comfortable after the exhausting day, and within seconds I fell completely asleep, still wearing my sweater and holding the novel I had been trying to finish. I never heard Vivian end her phone call. I never heard her place her briefcase on the floor. The next thing I remember was the quiet sound of footsteps stopping beside the bed. I slowly opened my eyes and saw Vivian standing a few feet away. Her face carried the unmistakable strain of someone who had spent the entire day solving impossible problems. She looked at me with surprise, confusion, and instinctive discomfort. Before either of us had a chance to think, she spoke in the same controlled voice she used inside corporate boardrooms. "Get out of my bed." There was no shouting. No anger. No cruelty in her expression. Only exhaustion speaking faster than compassion. The words settled over the room like ice. My heart sank before my mind could catch up. I stood immediately, clutching my book against my chest. "I am so sorry," I whispered. "I thought I was in the other room." She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though realizing what had just happened, but neither of us said another word. I quietly walked past her, returned to the guest room, and gently closed the door behind me. On the other side of the wall, silence filled the apartment once again. Neither of us slept well for the rest of the night, and neither of us understood that by morning, the distance between us would feel far greater than the few steps separating our two bedrooms. Morning arrived quietly, but nothing about it felt peaceful. I woke before dawn after barely sleeping, replaying the previous night's moment again and again until the words no longer sounded angry. They simply sounded final. I knew Vivian had been exhausted, and I knew I had wandered into the wrong room by accident, but understanding the reason behind someone's words does not always lessen the pain they leave behind. I looked around the guest room that had slowly begun to feel like home over the past several weeks. The bookshelf where I had arranged my favorite novels. The small potted plant sitting on the windowsill. The framed drawing one of my students had made for me that read, "Best Teacher Ever." Somehow everything looked temporary again. I folded my blankets carefully, packed my suitcase, and placed every borrowed hanger back inside the closet exactly where I had found it. There was no anger in my movements. Only quiet gratitude mixed with sadness. Before leaving, I cleaned the kitchen one last time. I washed the coffee mugs drying beside the sink, wiped the counters until they shined, and restocked the refrigerator with the groceries I had bought the evening before. The chicken soup we had made together weeks earlier had reminded me that homes were built from ordinary moments, and I wanted to leave one final ordinary kindness behind. On the kitchen island, I placed the guest room key beside a neatly folded envelope. Inside was a short handwritten letter. I thanked Vivian for opening her home to someone she barely knew. I told her that living there had reminded me that kindness could exist in unexpected places. I apologized once more for entering the wrong bedroom and explained that I never wanted her to feel uncomfortable inside her own home. At the bottom of the page I wrote one final sentence. "Some people change our lives without realizing it, and I hope one day you discover that you deserve the same compassion you give your company every single day." I signed only my name. Before walking out, I paid my share of the utility bill online, printed the receipt, and tucked it beneath the envelope so there would be nothing left unresolved. The apartment was completely silent as I pulled my suitcase toward the front door. I paused for one last look at the skyline beyond the towering windows. New York was beginning to wake, painted in soft shades of gold as the sun climbed above the buildings. I smiled sadly, whispered a quiet thank you to an empty room, and closed the door behind me. Less than an hour later, Vivian stepped out of her bedroom intending to apologize before I left for work. She had rehearsed the words during the restless hours before dawn. She expected to find me making coffee or searching for my school bag. Instead, she found perfect stillness. My mug was gone. The guest room door stood open. The bed was neatly made, the closet was empty, and the little potted plant that had brightened the windowsill had disappeared. Confused, she walked into the kitchen and immediately noticed the envelope resting beside the key. As she read the letter, her shoulders slowly sank. She reached the final sentence and remained standing there for several long moments, staring at my handwriting while the untouched breakfast I had prepared waited quietly on the stove. For the first time in years, the penthouse no longer felt comfortably quiet. It felt painfully empty. The silence that had once protected her from the demands of the world suddenly became unbearable. Vivian looked toward the front door as though hoping it might open again if she waited long enough, but deep inside she already understood the truth. The person who had quietly transformed her house into a home had walked away without asking for anything in return, and for the first time in her carefully controlled life, success offered no solution to the mistake she wished she could take back. For the first 2 days after Claire left, I convinced myself she simply needed space. I told myself she would return after the weekend to collect something she had forgotten, or perhaps send a message explaining where she had moved. Every time my phone lit up, I caught myself hoping to see her name, only to find another meeting reminder or another email demanding immediate attention. By the third day, I realized I had spent more time staring at an empty kitchen than reviewing the largest business proposal of my career. The apartment had returned to exactly what it had been before Claire arrived. Everything was spotless. Everything was organized. Everything was painfully quiet. The handwritten notes had disappeared from the kitchen counter. No fresh coffee waited beside the espresso machine. No soft humming drifted through the hallway on Saturday mornings. I had once believed silence was the reward for success. Now it sounded like regret. On Thursday evening, I drove to the elementary school where Claire had often talked about her students with a smile that no corporate achievement had ever placed on my own face. School had already ended for the day, but a custodian kindly pointed me toward the playground, where several teachers were helping children finish an after-school reading program. Claire was not there. One of the teachers recognized her name immediately. "She volunteers at the community center on Thursdays," she said with a warm smile. "She never misses it." I thanked her and drove across the city without thinking about traffic for the first time in years. The community center occupied an aging brick building tucked between a neighborhood library and a small public park. It was nothing like the polished offices where I spent most of my life. Children laughed in one room while older adults gathered for a weekly craft class down the hallway. The building was modest, but every corner seemed filled with warmth. I asked the receptionist whether Claire was there. She smiled kindly before shaking her head. She stopped by this morning to drop off books for the tutoring program, but she had to leave early. Before I could hide my disappointment, an elderly volunteer sitting nearby looked up from folding donated blankets. "You must be Vivian," she said gently. I stared in surprise. "How did you know my name?" The woman smiled. "Claire talked about you. She said you worked harder than anyone she had ever met and that you forgot to take care of yourself." I lowered my eyes, unable to answer. The volunteer continued folding blankets before speaking again. Every month Claire organized food drives, read stories to children, and spent time visiting seniors who did not have family nearby. She never wanted recognition. She simply believed everyone deserved to feel remembered. As I listened, I realized there were entire chapters of Claire's life I had never known because she had never spoken about them unless someone else needed help. On my way back toward the exit, I noticed a bulletin board covered with handwritten thank you cards. One card, decorated with colorful crayon hearts, caught my attention. It read, "Thank you, Miss Claire, for teaching me that being kind makes people feel brave." I stood there for several long moments, reading those simple words again and again. Billion-dollar contracts had never changed me the way one child's sentence just had. Walking back to my car beneath the fading evening sky, I finally understood what I had truly lost. I was not searching for a roommate anymore. I was searching for the one person who had quietly taught me that success could build companies, but only compassion could build a meaningful life, and I knew I could not stop looking until I found the chance to tell her that she had been right all along. Nearly 3 weeks passed before I finally found Claire again. It happened on a crisp Saturday afternoon in Central Park, not because I had planned it, but because one of the volunteers from the community center mentioned that Claire organized a monthly outdoor reading circle for children whose families could not always afford books. When I arrived, I stayed several yards away, afraid that walking toward her too quickly might erase the fragile chance I had been given. Claire sat beneath a large maple tree surrounded by a semicircle of smiling children, holding an illustrated storybook while autumn leaves drifted gently across the grass. Her voice carried warmth that seemed to calm everyone around her. The children laughed at every character she introduced, and every few pages she paused to ask questions that encouraged even the shyest child to join the conversation. Watching her from a distance, I finally understood why every person I had met during my search spoke about her with such affection. She had a remarkable way of making people feel seen. When the reading session ended, the children raced toward nearby parents and grandparents, each carrying a borrowed book beneath one arm. Claire remained behind to stack folding chairs and gather blankets. She looked up just as I slowly approached. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. Surprise crossed her face first, followed by uncertainty, but not anger. "Hello, Vivian," she said quietly. "Hello, Claire." My carefully rehearsed speech disappeared the instant I saw her. I took a slow breath before speaking honestly. I have spent years building companies, solving problems, and making difficult decisions. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to build trust. The words hung gently between us. Claire lowered the last folded blanket onto the bench beside her before answering. "Trust is never something you earn all at once," she said softly. "It is something you practice every day, especially when it is inconvenient." I nodded because I knew she was right. I have replayed that night more times than I can count. I was exhausted, but that is an explanation, not an excuse. You deserved kindness, and instead I gave you distance. Claire looked toward the children playing across the lawn before meeting my eyes again. "I knew you did not mean to hurt me." What hurt was believing that after everything we had shared, your first instinct was still to push me away. I felt every word because they were true. "I cannot change what happened," I admitted. "But I can choose who I become because of it." A gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves between us. Claire smiled sadly. "Do you know what my students teach me every year?" I shook my head. That learning only happens after someone admits they still have something to learn. For the first time in weeks, I smiled without forcing it. We began walking slowly along the path that curved around the lake. There was no dramatic declaration, no impossible promise, and no expectation that everything would immediately return to the way it had been. Instead, we talked about ordinary things. My board meeting that had finally ended successfully. Her students preparing for the school art fair. The elderly volunteer who kept winning every community center trivia contest. The conversation felt natural because it had always been friendship before it had ever become something deeper. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the water, I realized that forgiveness was not a destination waiting at the end of the path. It was the quiet decision to keep walking beside someone who was willing to grow, one honest step at a time. The months that followed did not erase what had happened, but they transformed what it meant. Claire never moved back into the penthouse, and I never asked her to. We both understood that rebuilding trust required patience instead of pressure. We started with simple things. Saturday morning coffee after her reading program. Evening walks through neighborhoods neither of us had taken time to explore before. Dinner at small family-owned restaurants where nobody recognized my face from business magazines and everyone greeted Claire by name. For the first time in my adult life, my calendar contained appointments that had nothing to do with investors, quarterly reports, or corporate strategy. They simply said, "Coffee with Claire," or "Volunteer at the community center." Strangely, those became the meetings I protected most carefully. My colleagues noticed the difference before I did. They commented that I smiled more often during presentations. I listened longer before making decisions. I stopped scheduling conference calls late into the evening and encouraged my executive team to spend more time with their families. At first they assumed it was a temporary change brought on by exhaustion. They were wrong. I had finally learned that leadership was not measured only by results. It was also measured by the way people felt after working beside you. Claire continued teaching with the same quiet dedication that had first inspired me. One afternoon I visited her classroom after receiving permission from the school principal. I watched as she knelt beside a student struggling with a reading assignment, offering encouragement instead of criticism. The child eventually smiled with pride after finishing the page alone. As we walked out of the school together, I realized Claire approached every person the same way. She never asked who deserved kindness. She simply chose to give it. Nearly 6 months after we first met in that towering Manhattan penthouse, I made a decision that surprised everyone except Claire. I sold the apartment. Business reporters speculated endlessly about financial reasons, investment strategies, and changing market conditions. The truth was much simpler. The penthouse had been built to impress people. It had never been built to hold a life. Together we found a modest brownstone on a quiet tree-lined street in Brooklyn. It had a small front porch, a cozy kitchen with slightly uneven hardwood floors, and a backyard just large enough for a vegetable garden that Claire insisted we plant ourselves. On moving day, there were no photographers waiting outside, no luxury moving service directing every detail, and no headlines announcing another billionaire purchase. There were only 2 women carrying boxes, laughing after discovering we had packed far too many coffee mugs, and a few kind neighbors who introduced themselves before offering homemade muffins as a welcome gift. That first evening we sat on the back steps watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink. The garden was still nothing more than freshly turned soil, and several unopened boxes waited inside the house, but somehow everything already felt complete. Claire slipped her hand gently into mine and smiled toward the little home we were beginning to build together. I smiled back, realizing that for years I had believed success meant reaching the highest floor in the tallest building. I had been chasing the wrong destination all along. Home was never measured by square feet, breathtaking views, or extraordinary wealth. Home was the quiet place where forgiveness was stronger than pride, where kindness was practiced every day, and where 2 ordinary hearts chose each other again after learning that love grows strongest when it is rooted in respect, humility, and the courage to become better than the person you were yesterday.